5th. And today's hearing is about the fiscal note process, and I wanted to give a little brief background for the purpose of this hearing and where it came about from. And this is like we had a discussion of Senate or of legislative budget rules a couple weeks ago. This hearing came out of, there was a hearing at the end of the last session where members of both parties in the Senate Finance Committee raised concerns when we had the fiscal note from one of the bills, the paid family medical leave bill, and there were some things in the fiscal note that the Legislative Budget Office flagged for us at the time, and about assumed adjustment in rates and actuarial analysis things and so on. And there was agreement afterwards because of, I think, the bipartisan concerns at the here about the fiscal note, was that there should be a separate meeting of the Legislative Budget Oversight Commission, which Senator Wickland chairs, to talk about the concerns and make sure we have a standard process for fiscal notes. And doing scheduling and technical issues in these hearing rooms last fall, the Legislative Budget Oversight Commission did not have a chance to meet. So we were hoping to do it before we got too far into the session. And because the Budget Oversight Commission hasn't been reconstituted because of the House things right now, Senator Pratt and I agreed we should take up these issues in the Senate Finance Committee hearing, which we're having today. Again, I think there was bipartisan concern that the LBO budget process has to be respected, and we want to, well, I can go into more details about some concerns we have later, but I want to start by saying that looking at this one particular fiscal note is partly to make sure that we have a process that's understood across the administrative agencies and so on, and that we can do better in the future. And with that, before we have the Legislative Budget Office make a presentation, I wonder if Senator Pratt had any comments on this?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this meeting. I think it's very important. You know, we're in charge of a lot of money that comes from our taxpayers, and making sure that we pass laws understanding the full impact of what that means. And the fiscal note is our primary tool for doing that. We created the Legislative Budget Office because we had bipartisan concerns over the fiscal notes that we were getting in both the House and the Senate, and wanted to have an independent body really representing us in that process. And, you know, I think today's discussion is not about the the bill that brought it here, but really the process and the role of the Legislative Budget Office, but I think also the assumptions that we see coming from the agencies, recognizing that the LBO is our representative in that process, and making sure that we support the LBO and make sure that agencies understand the expectations we have for these fiscal notes as we use them going forward. So again, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm looking forward to today's presentations.
And then I'll see if Senator Wickland is chair of the Legislative Budget Office Oversight Commissioner LeBouc, if she has any comments or anything else you want to add.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just will say I think it's good that we have an opportunity to have this discussion. It didn't work out to have last fall, and I think that having a chance to discuss it and find ways that we can strengthen the process, both for the LBO and for agencies to work with the LBO and with us, I think that's a good thing, and we can do it early in session now and have the communication happening as we move into the LBO working diligently on fiscal notes that we request. And so it's good to have the discussion now, and hopefully it will lead to, productive communication. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we'll begin with the Legislative Budget Office presentation. Christian Larson and Alyssa Holterman-Rosas. Mr. Larson, welcome to the committee.
I'll just take a moment to get set up here.
And members, I think he has a PowerPoint, but you have the presentation in your packets as well as his memo on this, or the LBO memo on this.
Chair Marty and members of the Senate Finance Committee, my name is Christian Larson, Director of the Legislative Budget Office. And just, everyone can hear me okay? All right. I was asked to come before you today, as Chair Marty said, to speak about the fiscal notes for the paid leave law developed in the 2024 legislative session. These were fiscal notes proposing changes to the 2023 session law, Chapter 59. There was a Senate Finance Committee hearing on May 10th, 2024 on Senate File 5430, which included discussion of members' concerns with these fiscal notes, which prompted today's discussion. As Senator Marty said, there's a memo on the topic provided in your packets. I think it's important, before we get into the conversation or the presentation, to really kind of understand that what we're talking today is not the law as it currently stands today. We're talking about the laws enacted in 2023 and any fiscal notes related to the proposed changes in 2024. And so that's not to say that we're talking exactly today as the law stands, but rather, again, what was enacted in 2023 and any changes proposed in 2024. Please feel free to stop me throughout the presentation and ask any questions that you have. In today's discussion, we'll talk really through three things. First, we'll lay some background on what you need to know to kind of understand why the fiscal note ended up being a challenge. We'll talk about the challenges and concerns raised by members during that May 10th hearing. And then we'll talk about suggested interventions the LBO in consultation with other groups have developed to say, how do we move forward to make sure that we can address some of the concerns that were identified through the fiscal notes developed for the paid leave law in 2024. Just some background. The paid leave law was originally passed in the 2023 legislative session. And it's important to understand the benefit and payments don't happen until January 1, 2026. And so the law was passed and it hasn't yet begun. And so that will help kind of help you all understand what challenges were associated with the program, developing a fiscal estimate for the program. The fiscal note methodology prior to 2024 legislative session used a microsimulation model developed by the Department of Labor that really is a estimate of worker leave, and that was used between about 2019 and 2023, and so that was what was used in the enacting legislation in terms of developing estimates for the law. In 2024, an actuarial analysis was released as required by the 2023 enacting legislation. In that October actuarial analysis, or I'm sorry, the actuarial analysis required in the enacting legislation came out in October of 2023 and provided two scenarios based on two premium contribution rates. The first being contribution rate as defined in statute of 0.7% in the first year, and then a variable rate defined based on a formula thereafter. And then an alternative rate proposed in the October actuarial analysis had a contribution rate of 0.78% in the first year, and that reduced premium fluctuations in the first 5 years and also increased the fund balance in that first year. And the actuarial analysis described that as being preferable. Leading up to the 2024 legislative session, or early in the legislative session, the Legislative Budget Office met with both Department of Employment and Economic Development, with MMB, and with House and Senate fiscal staff to kind of talk about the challenges and underlying issues with the developing estimates for the fiscal notes for the paid family leave law. In part of those discussions, things that came out with DEED is that really there was questions of how do we approach estimating impacts to the paid leave law for a program that hasn't started. It's an entitlement program, and we have two methodologies that have been used in the past to estimate the program. Really what's expected, I think was the question is, do we continue to use this microsimulation model, or should we use the actuarial analysis, and what should we use to project changes from that? And there's resource questions related to that. Both happen to be resource intensive, whether it's staff time or funding for actuarial analysis. Also, before we kind of get into the details of the fiscal note in question, just some basics on fiscal notes. So fiscal notes are governed through Minnesota Statute 3.98. That's the enacting legislation for fiscal notes. And it's also in more detail governed through the Fiscal Note Uniform Standards and Procedures, which is overseen by the Legislative Budget Office Oversight Commission. Again, that's a commission of the House and the Senate, 4 members from the House and 4 members from the Senate. Those standards set for fiscal notes determine that estimates of the fiscal note must come from the current law base. And so we have to have a starting point. Where are we measuring from for a fiscal note? And that is that current law base. Again, that's going to come into that's going to lead into some of the challenges around this fiscal note. Assumptions need to be reasonable, accurate, and objective. And assumptions and methodologies provided in the fiscal note must be sufficient in detail to support the fiscal estimates. And so generally, there's a lot of detail on what has to go into a fiscal note, but this is basically what we're looking for as an office. So the challenges with the paid leave law, really there's 3 things, and it all comes down to really defining baseline. And the first is there was no obvious and apparent baseline from which to measure changes. The options really were the enacted budget in 2023 or that October actuarial analysis. The decision point came down to those 2, and the question is for a program that hasn't started yet, that is an entitlement program, what's the best baseline to measure changes from? Second, there was refinement of agency interpretation of the law following the 2023 legislative session, and this is really going to focus around what does a 7-day qualifying event mean, and really come down to the question of were those first 7 days to be paid under the established statute? And then finally, the use of permissive authority to adjust the first-year premiums was assumed in the 2024 fiscal notes. And what does that mean for a baseline? If it was assumed and the underlying statute said a premium rate of 0.7%, but there was permissive language to adjust that, how does that get reflected in a fiscal note? And that really, I think those 3 things led to the discussion and the challenges and the concerns by the committee last May. So establishing baseline, kind of walking through this in a little more detail. Why is this challenging for the paid leave program? Again, fiscal notes are measured from the current law base. And the current law base means either the end of session budget or for forecasted programs, oftentimes it means what's included in the most recent MMB budget and economic forecast, especially for general fund programs, that not all non-general fund programs are included in the forecast. And in this case, the paid family and medical leave law or the paid leave program was not included in the forecast before November 2024. So there wasn't a forecast to rely on for determining baseline in the 2024 session. Again, there was an actuarial analysis required in the enacting legislation completed prior to the 2024 legislative session. So that really gave you 2 choices for the baseline. Is it the enacted budget or is it the October actuarial analysis? In the end, so when we met with DEED, we met with House and Senate fiscal staff, we met with MMB, we all came to the conclusion that the best choice was to work from the October 2023 actuarial analysis. That provided the most recent and likely the most accurate fiscal estimates for the program. It's consistent with practice for other entitlement programs in the sense that you use that most recent forecast information, albeit this was from a third party. And at the time we didn't know it, but in terms of how the fiscal note was estimated for the 2024 proposed changes, they ended up going back to the same actuary, so Millman was the actuary who produced the 2023 October actuarial analysis. Updated actuarial analysis were completed for proposed changes in the 2024 session, and so in that way we could measure across the same methodology. So if we were to say we're going to use the microsimulation model and then measure against an actuarial analysis, you are measuring somewhat a change in assumptions based on the proposed changes in the law, but you're also measuring across the methodologies. And so when you look at what the final change in the fiscal note would have been, you're measuring both of those things, which is not really the point of the fiscal note, but rather what's the change from the base to the change in the new assumptions. And so for those 3 reasons, it made sense to go with this October actuarial analysis as the baseline. The big disadvantage and where a lot of the challenge comes from is that it doesn't provide a measure from the 2023 enacted budget. And so we think about what was the enacted budget at the end of the 2023 session to what this new understood baseline is. That wouldn't get measured in the fiscal note if we start using this October actuarial analysis as the baseline. And that is, I think, what drove the challenge and I think the concern from the committee. So that's kind of thinking about just baseline. Now let's kind of talk about the refinement of agency assumptions regarding days of eligible payment for the paid leave law. And this really is related to the 7-day qualifying event. So to be eligible to receive benefits under the paid leave law, the enacting legislation required a 7-day qualifying event. In the 2023 fiscal notes, so in the fiscal notes for the proposed enacting legislation, there was no assumed waiting period to get paid. So although you needed 7 days to become eligible, you were eligible to get paid for that first day. So it'd be like a retro pay. I'm going back and getting paid for my first 7 days. Upon passage, and DEED refined their understanding of the language and went and said, actually those first 7 days, the 7-day qualifying event actually means there's a 7-day waiting period, and so I really don't get paid until the 8th day that I'm eligible of my qualifying event. And so that again is a question of the baseline. What is the baseline? Is the baseline the legislative understanding and the legislative intent possibly at the time of passage of no waiting period? Or is the baseline a 7-day waiting period, so benefits aren't going to be paid for those first 7 days? And obviously you can assume that those first 7 days paid obviously has a substantial fiscal effect on the estimates of the program. And on top of this, the proposed changes in the 2024 language clarified that those first 7 days will be paid or will be paid for a certain subset of beneficiaries. And so that piece is, the question is what gets measured between what was assumed to be the program at the end of the 2023 session to what is now the new base out of that October actual analysis. Finally, the last piece that caused, I think, confusion and concern in the fiscal note around these fiscal note assumptions was DEED exercising authority to adjust premium rates in year one of the program. So in the enacting legislation, the first year premium rate is established at 0.7% for family medical benefits for employers that are going to provide both family medical benefits for the state. And then the second year and onward, the premium rate was established using a formula with a 1.2% cap of taxable wages. It was related to fund balance and the prior usage and some other things like that. The actual analysis, as we had said, also included an alternative to that funding model of saying if you would even out the premium rate so there's less fluctuation and provide a higher fund balance early in the existence of the program, which it said is preferable, then you could have a premium rate of 0.78% in the first year, and actually for the first 4 years, and then beyond that, I think it was estimated to be around 0.83%. DEED said that based on the actual analysis that we received, that they think that met the statutory obligation of the program not being actually sound. Therefore, they have the authority to change that first year premium rate. And to be kind of just provide a little bit more of that discussion during the Senate Finance Committee, there was questions of if it really was the first year premium rate that could be adjusted as opposed to the second year rate or the year of the second year and beyond, based on how you read the language. There was some discussion on that. But in the end, the same issue really exists in the sense that what are you measuring from the base and what gets lost when you change the base assumption. So if you're measuring from 0.7%, and that's the generally understood premium rate the first year, and you reset the base at 0.78%, you now have lost the difference between 0.7 and 0.78% in premiums collected, and so that information is not provided in the fiscal note. And that, I think, is, again, where members had concern. So it's really, again, going back to what was the general underlying issue is if we reset the base and we lose any kind of estimate of the fiscal impact between what the old base was and the new base is, that, I think, was concerning to the members. So that leads us to suggested interventions of how to address this type of challenge moving forward. And we've developed some suggestions to address some of these issues. The first is that the LBO can be more assertive in communication clear expectations for information required in a fiscal note to meet standards. And to be clear, this doesn't mean we are dictating assumptions, that the fiscal note process is set up so that the agencies are developing the estimates based on a set of assumptions, and the LBO reviews those to make sure they're reasonable, accurate, and objective. I think in reviewing our communication with the agency, there was a lot of communication between us and the agency. There was a lot of work put into this note. There's a lot of discussions that we could have said early on, boy, we really need to see these 5 things in the fiscal note for us to think that this is really complete and the full picture of the fiscal effect is there. And I think we could have been more clear earlier in the process. And so that's something internally we can look at and say, okay, how early can we get out to the agency? Like, this is really what we want to see. Is that what you're seeing so that we can get on the same page? I think there's also opportunities for the LBO to provide more detailed analysis with fiscal notes in certain situations. And the first of those situations is like the paid family medical, the paid leave law fiscal notes from 2024. And these are cases where we think the note does technically meet standards, but more information would be useful to understand the full effect. And in this case, with the full effect being what was the assumption of the old base to the new base, so that the members have that type of information that's not included in the fiscal note. We could come forward with some kind of analysis to the committee and say, hey, here's information that's not included in the fiscal note that's very relevant to understand the cost and the fiscal effect of the program. And we think we currently have that authority, and we can start stepping into that space. The other scenario in this case is where we think a fiscal note does not meet standards. And so that's not the case we're talking about the 2024 paid leave laws, but rather in cases where we cannot come to an agreement with the agency that assumptions are allowed. And this is also allowed under our uniform standards and procedures. We have the authority to release a fiscal note as unapproved and say this fiscal note does not meet standards, and here's our concerns with that. And so we have that authority. We have yet to exercise that authority in the 6 years that we've been around. And there's a couple reasons we've been cautious about using that. The first is that when a fiscal note starts leaving our office, we want that to mean a fiscal, like that we think that is a reasonable and accurate picture of the fiscal effect of a bill. And so if we start having fiscal notes that float around that means something other than that, it could devalue the meaning of a fiscal note. And so we're very cautious to make sure that if anything would come out, it's very clear that it's not approved and why that's not approved. The second issue is really a timing issue. The LBO was working with agencies all the way up oftentimes to the night before or even hours before a committee hearing to make sure a fiscal note is meeting standards. The question is how much time would we have if we say we're going to release a note unapproved and we need to provide information to the committee that would help inform the discussion. Would we have enough time to have the right information at hand, develop our own estimates if needed, so that we can have that information for the committee? And it's a timing issue, and we'd have to reconsider when we start saying, okay, we need to start pivoting, develop, and collect information so that we can make and provide information to the committee that is useful, and so in a format that's useful. And so that, I think, is the two challenges with us going down this road of releasing unapproved notes. But to be clear, we do have that authority under the current uniform standards and procedures. Continuing on, for significant fiscal notes or for new programs, agencies engage early in the process of developing fiscal note estimates, providing preliminary assumptions and outline approach to fiscal note assumptions. Again, there's nothing stopping this from currently happening. It's just perhaps a little bit of a change of practice. So the LBO reached out early in the process for developing this fiscal note, Deed engaged and said, here's the challenges we think about having. And then if there could have been a discussion around, hey, let's have this, this is generally how we think we're going to approach this early in the process, so that when those fiscal note requests came in April, we have a good understanding of what are the gaps in information so we can make sure those are addressed either through the fiscal note or outside of the fiscal note process, so the right information is getting to the agency or to the committees so that the information really to make the full information that might be needed to understand the fiscal effects of a proposed bill are understood. Now, the challenge with this is that oftentimes it's the developing assumptions that takes the vast majority of time in a fiscal note. So it could be that we reach out early in the process to coordinate this communication, and the agency is not sure at that time what is, how are we going to approach this estimate. But I think the earlier engagement we can have in that process, the better off we are to, again, identify those gaps in information that might be really useful to the committee, and for us to identify and say, like, well, we also need to see this to be really comfortable in signing off on that note. We think it's useful for agencies to communicate with legislative members and staff regarding substantial changes to assumptions related to existing programs, and the LBO should be included in these communications. And so in this case, if we could have had a really clear understanding, and some of this communication may have taken place, we're certainly not involved in all the communication, but when we can get pulled in and say, here's what's been communicated to members, and then therefore, again, identifying those gaps in information, how can we provide that information, I think is useful to have a really clear process saying, like, these are the people that need to be informed before a fiscal note gets released to say, here's things that can be confusing, how do we provide that information so that we can clarify any concerns. We think it's useful for the legislature and the LBO Oversight Commission to reiterate the importance of fiscal notes being developed independent of political considerations. And that's not to state that this fiscal note was developed with political considerations or not. It's just the more that the legislature can highlight the importance of the objectivity and the process used for fiscal notes, and the importance that what's carried in these uniform standards and procedures needs to be carried out, the better off we are when we go talk to agencies and say like, hey, we're not signing off for this reason. We need to see these things. So I think that's really useful, just to make that clear. Again, it's in the Uniform Standards and Procedures, and generally agencies do engage with us and work hard to make sure that fiscal notes are accurate and estimate. But I think anytime we can have the legislature just highlight this as an important thing, does provide credence when we reach out to agencies with our concerns. We think it's possible that the Legislative Budget Office Oversight Commission could establish a working group. And when we think about a working group, we're thinking about state entities responding to fiscal note requests, the Legislative Budget Office, MMB and nonpartisan staff in the House and Senate, and to kind of look at, is there additional standards and procedures that should be developed in three situations? The first being, in cases where an agency has substantial updates to assumptions previously used in the fiscal note estimates or in fiscal estimates included in the budget and economic forecast. So if something is going to change substantially from a previous understanding of how a fiscal note has been developed for a program to what the now new assumptions are, should there be standards for that? Very similar to the situation we had with the paid leave law. So there's a substantial update to assumptions. Should there be standards in place that address this specifically? To be clear that when there is changes to assumptions in programs that are forecasted programs, that does get addressed in the forecast, and MMB communicates those changes and things of that nature. Should there be something special in regards to how that impacts the fiscal note process, that there's how that gets communicated or how it gets addressed and what clearly is expectation could be useful. I think also in cases where substantially complex or new programs are proposed, should there be a separate standard related to those type of situations? We certainly have standards that can address some of these issues, but should there be a separate standard or separate procedure for complex new programs? And then finally, for situations that may require an agency to work through a third party to develop estimates, is that something that the commission should consider? Is that what's a reasonable expectation for an agency if 5 fiscal notes come in, is expected that to go through the third party 5 times to get estimates? Like what is expected of an agency in that capacity? I think it's worthwhile for the commission to consider that, and probably to have some information collected from the nonpartisan staff and the staff related to those issues. And finally, we think it'd be useful for D to share their plan for estimating the fiscal impact of proposed changes to the paid leave law in 2025 and beyond. Some of these issues have been resolved in the sense that the paid leave law is now included in was included in the November forecast this last year, and so we have a baseline in terms of that capacity. Some of the assumptions around the change of the 7 days, how the qualifying event in this first 7 days was clarified in language at the end of 2024 session, so that's addressed. And the premium language, the ability to change the premium was clarified as well. But I think the question still comes down to how are we going to make estimates for this program moving forward, especially before it starts. And so if there's changes proposed between now and 2026, how are those going to be estimated? And so that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Director Larson. Questions from the committee before we, Senator Murphy and then Senator Drahan. Okay, go ahead, Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that we're having this discussion. And there's a lot here. I'm sure you're going to hear questions from members, specifically to the issue of the fiscal note regarding paid family medical leave. I am curious about item 6 on the suggested interventions. One of the reasons why this issue was so difficult from my perspective last spring was it felt like it was tugging at the very integrity of the work that we count on to make policy and budget decisions going forward. And I am curious if when you think about the LBO Oversight Commission and establishing a working group, if there are themes that you deal with from members regarding the composition of and credibility of fiscal notes that would be a part of this kind of a discussion. And I ask because I think it is important that legislators, people elected to do this work for the people of Minnesota, have confidence in the work that's coming out of the LBO. And sometimes we, for lack of a better term, will trash talk fiscal notes when we're frustrated about them. And I want to make sure that that kind of talk doesn't bleed into the credibility that you have.
Mr. Larson.
Senator Marty and Senator Murphy, thank you for the question. Yeah, so I think it really, having this discussion today, I think really points to the fact that we need to make fiscal notes, and the integrity of fiscal notes is incredibly important, and that's the number one priority of our office, is to say, like, when something comes out of our office, it does meet standards. We hear from members at times, there's questions about how a fiscal note was approached, the assumptions used, was there some kind of intent behind it to say, I want it to be more or less expensive because I support or don't support a bill? Like, certainly we know those discussions happen, and at times we're approached with concerns. Our staff takes a lot of effort and a lot of pride in making sure that we are independent and objective and making sure that we have consistent review of fiscal notes. It doesn't mean we can't continue to strengthen those standards and make sure that things are consistent. I will say, I talk to our staff a lot about, we're kind of the umpires in the fiscal note process. And umpires don't get noticed until they miss a call, right? If I'm calling balls and strikes, you're not upset with us until there's a call in the margins and you think that's a ball and we're calling it a strike. And so I think that is inherent in how we're set up. We're an oversight body and reviewing fiscal notes. We're not writing them. All that to say is that I think it's inherent in the work. That's going to exist however many standards get developed. That, I think, is inherent in the process. But I do think we can consistently grow in making sure that when a fiscal note comes out, we do really have good information, that we can continue to grow in our ability to say, okay, we've really vetted the information that goes into a fiscal note. We've asked the right questions. We've found our own data and to validate. And I think, again, having this discussion today just reiterates to the people completing fiscal notes that these questions are important, and that provides us support when we go out to agencies and say, hey, this doesn't meet standards. We need to see this to have it improved. That by having this discussion today and these types of discussions, it allows us to have more weight when we say that.
Senator Draheim.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for having this discussion today. Thanks for your presentation, and I'm kind of going back to the authority to adjust the rate. How many times does this happen? Is this kind of how often are you having to adjust whatever bill we send to the agency, blah, 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 to get a fiscal note to make it work?
So this one is somewhat unique in the sense that is such a paramount assumption in the estimate of the fiscal note. And again, then that changes what we're understanding that gets included in the fiscal note from the 0.7% to 0.78% in this case as the baseline. And so how often does it happen? Not that often. This is somewhat rare, but it's not completely. Anytime there's permissive language in a bill, it allows for that to happen. I would say this is the most, kind of the biggest example we've experienced in our 6 years as an office. And so, and then there always, the question is, and we had these discussions a lot with the agency and with fiscal staff, whatever, like, how do we approach that? What is the right answer? And the baseline is, the standard and the fiscal notes are, how will the agency apply the law? And so at the time of the 2023 session, the assumption was they'd apply the law with the base of 0.7%. The actuarial analysis comes out, and the agency says, well, we were reacting to the actuarial analysis. Now we will apply the law at 0.78%. That technically is how the agency assumes they will apply the law at that time. So therefore, that technically meets standards of saying that's the baseline. But it does beg the question, what needs to be included in the fiscal note? Because that change of assumption is paramount to understanding the full fiscal effect of changing that, making that assumption.
Follow up, Chair? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Larson, for that. And, so in the 6 years, can you give me a number, how many times that's happened is my first question. But my real question is, what happens when this rare event happens? Do you communicate that back to, the department, the chief author, the leads on the committees at a jurisdiction, or the chair of the finance committee? What happens if you do have to make adjustment?
Go ahead, Senator Marty and Senator Drahan. Yeah, so in this case, so I don't have a number for you. I don't know how many times it's happened. We can go back and see if there's other examples, but we complete about 700 fiscal notes a year, and it would be hard for us to kind of pull that number. In terms of what we did in this case, we communicated with Senate fiscal staff that this was an issue. We certainly communicated a lot with the agency about that as an issue and making that assumption how that changes the understanding of the fiscal note and what might be the reaction of the committee in saying, how do I understand this information? And so we tried to communicate it that way to make sure that the parties engaged understood that that is a challenge, that seems to have, there's information that's relevant and useful that wouldn't be included in the fiscal note. In the end, we thought it wouldn't, that the standards are technically met, so we signed off with providing a relatively substantial comment, trying to point to the fact. I do think moving forward, the question then is, maybe we fill that gap. We know that we knew the information gap existed, so either we or we asked the agency or in this case, Senate fiscal staff could fill that gap. I think that's a step we should have taken, or someone in the process we could have talked and worked as to make sure that information gets provided earlier, as opposed to after it comes out and says this is an issue.
Chair, if I could
Go
just
ahead,
a comment. I appreciate the answer, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to understand. So I appreciate your feedback. So to me, not only the author should know what's going on if there's an adjustment, but I think the leads and the jurisdiction should know, and then I think obviously this committee leads should be in the loop too, moving forward if we are going to make adjustments. So just a suggestion. Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, thank you. Oh, Senator Pratt.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick comment and then a quick question. And I was kind of struck by intervention number 4. Agencies should communicate with legislative members and staff regarding substantial changes to assumptions. And I'm going to follow up on this a little bit later in this hearing, but it seems to me that that is the primary breakdown in this particular instance. And I appreciate, Senator Murphy's comments around suggestion 6. And I guess my question is, Mr. Larson, certainly we had a bill in 2021 for proposed changes to the LBO's authority that was authored by Senator Kiffmeyer, but included Senator Marty and Senator Wicklund, as well as former Senator Rosen on that bill. 2 questions. Are you looking at a process in suggestion number 6 that might be similar to the budget rules discussion that we just had, where the agencies and legislative staff come together and create baseline rules, or are you looking more at something like the bill from 2021 that would provide you more authority, or a combination of the 2?
Go ahead.
Senator Marty and Senator Pratt. So if we look at suggestion 4, agencies communicating with legislative members and staff regarding substantial changes to assumptions related to existing programs, and the LBO should be included in these communications, and we kind of combine that with suggestion 6 of some kind of a working group to look at standards. I don't think there's an expansion of the authority of the office required to do that, and I think that could happen through the uniform standards and procedures. In that way, I think that would be it's a good idea. I mean, I think the big lesson learned from this is that who needs to know, how fast can we get the information, and how do we fill that gap of information of what the fiscal note has, just inherently how it's built and what it's not going to include, but also is important information to understand the fiscal effects of a bill. And so how do we fill those gaps of information? I think that could all be handled through the standards and procedures. In terms of the bill that was proposed in 2021, Senator Kiffmeyer's bill from 2021, that would expand the authority of the office to complete notes when an agency doesn't provide a fiscal note that is suggested meets standards. It also has some language about access to data and information when you want to look back and say how accurate are we how accurate was the fiscal note, essentially, is the kind of the major piece of that bill. I think the fiscal note process generally does what it needs to do right now. I don't know if we need to expand our authority. I think it's a worthwhile discussion. I think from a sense of really addressing the issues that came through in this fiscal note, I don't think an expansion of authority is necessary. I think that can be handled through the standards and procedures and a really clear expectation and standard around how information gets displayed, who gets that information and when. I think that would manage that, that issue.
Thank you, Director Larson. Next, if we could have Deputy Commissioner Rowe from DEED. And I don't know if you have a presentation or just questions, but if you could respond to Director Larson's memo and presentation. Welcome to the committee, and please identify yourself for the record.
Thank you, Chair Marty and Senators. My name is Evan Rowe. I'm Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Employment and Economic Development, and I do not have a presentation, but perhaps I'll just offer a few quick, a few comments just in response to the memo and presentation that Director Larson just provided. I guess I would just first offer my appreciation for the thoughtful, recap of kind of the facts of the 2024 fiscal note process. And I'd just emphasize that, you know, I really appreciate this opportunity to kind of have a review and have a look back and note that we share the objective of providing really clear information to members of this committee and all the members and all the committees in the legislature. It's critically important that members have the information and analysis needed to make thoughtful policy decisions. I'd reiterate and emphasize Director Larson's note of the complexities of the 2024 bill, and that I think was inherent in some of the challenges, right? How does one clearly and coherently present information and changes when multiple things in a bill are changing? And I would just say that in our, in our attempt to provide that information clearly and concisely, again, we made every effort to follow the uniform standards and procedures. And there were some cases where, I would just say, like the complexity involved, there wasn't always a clear answer. And I would just say that we really appreciated our partnership with the LBO in conversations with them as we worked to get to there. I think, obviously, the nature of this hearing is that we're finding that there is room for improvement, and we look forward to that. A lot of this comes down to the information desired and making sure that it's clear what is being changed and how we can how we can kind of coherently show that information. I would say we welcome the clarity around expectations. I think one very clear takeaway is that in that draft of the fiscal note there should have been maybe some more information provided in the body of the document. That's a very clear takeaway that I would expect that we would seek to provide in future drafts. Again, I would also expect that future changes to the I would expect that future changes to the law will hopefully be fewer things will be changing at any one time. But I think a lot of this also, as Director Larson notes, comes down to communication, and I think that that's a commitment that we share and want to get right. I think it's communication with members, it's communication with the LBO. And, I think it's worth noting that there were a lot of time pressures last session. It was a short session to begin with, and there were, certain limitations and pressures that puts on. We have more time. I think we're having some very constructive conversations with LBO and certainly seek to have constructive conversations with members as we go so that we can all be on the same page and very clear about the information that's needed to help inform sound policy decisions. So that would just be my overview comments, but would welcome naturally any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from members of the committee. I'll just make one comment, and that is that I think one of the things that both in some of Director Larson's suggested interventions, the fourth one that I think Senator Pratt also pulled out, agencies should communicate with staff members regarding substantial changes to assumptions related to that, and LBO should be included in that. I think I'd go a little further than that and say that I also think it should be that when there are changes in assumptions, like when you were able to change the premium rate, I think there was some dispute over that, but when the department make that change, I think the fiscal note isn't the right place to make that announcement. I think that should have been done with the authors and legislators of both parties to make sure everybody's aware of those changes. Same thing with the first week, and that was one where the department felt it was unclear and the legislature clarified that. But I think that my pitch would be not only, as Director Larson says, is that agencies should communicate regarding those substantial changes, but they should never be that shouldn't be the place of disclosure in the fiscal note.
If I may, Senator Marty?
Please go ahead.
Thank you for that point. And I think one specific challenge just around that specific, I think the first year kind of premium reset authority, I appreciate that feedback. And I think, again, one challenge would be we wouldn't want to necessarily have made a big public splashy announcement about something like that, given that the legislation, that there was legislation pending going through the legislature. So, but I take that point very well. Fiscal note is not the venue for an announcement there. Certainly, I think it would probably be worth a conversation to kind of figure out what that would look like for the benefit of senators and members.
Other questions from members of the committee? Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Rowe. When I look at this fiscal note, right? And Mr. Larson touched on it, that the fiscal note does not have a comparison to the end of session 2023 budget. And there was a change made, even though statute clearly states that the first year will be a 0.7. I also get where there might be some ambiguity. When I offered the actuarial study language in the Jobs Committee and Senator Mann accepted it, and you were there, we talked about coming back to the legislature and having that discussion. Can you tell me how you communicated with the legislature that you were changing the underlying baseline assumption by 12%?
Senator, I guess, Mr. Chair, Senator, I guess perhaps our interpretation was rooted in the statute as we had, as the agency interpreted it. In developing a fiscal note, right, we're trying to establish baselines and we're trying to establish the change in the law as we understand it to be written. My understanding is that the fiscal note is not a tool that kind of is meant, as Senator Marty was just saying, it's not a tool for kind of announcing policy changes, but I would say it's also, normal for an agency to review the law and try to interpret it and interpret it in the best way that it possibly can. I'm not sure that answers your question.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Rowe, when the baseline assumption changed by 12%, right? That's the 8 basis point change that occurred. How was that communicated to the legislature? I sit on the Jobs Committee. I didn't hear about it. I sit on the Finance Committee. I didn't hear about it. How was that communicated to the legislature?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, I guess the agency's view would be that the baseline assumption did not change in the sense that the statute, as it was passed by the 2023 legislature, contained the permissive authority for the agency to change that, to change the policy, to change the premium rate if the premium rate was found by actuaries to not be actuarially sound. So I guess I understand the nature of the question. But I think what it ultimately comes down to was, when the actuaries conducted their analysis, they found that the formula in statute would have led to, under the 2023 law, would have led to at the 0.70 premium rate would have led to a program that would have been actuarially unsound. It would not collect sufficient resources in that first year, and it would require rather large oscillations in the overall premium rate. Now, so again, I guess I would say that the agency's view was that the baseline assumption had not changed. However, I guess what I think underlying that would be provided, if there are clear expectations around what that baseline needs to be, I guess, welcome that clarity. Additionally, I think in the body, in kind of the discussion and providing additional context, I think we certainly, and the ultimate fiscal note reflected this, I think we could have provided additional context, and I think it's very clear from this conversation and other conversations with legislators that that is a desire of this body, and that's certainly a desire that we can seek to meet going forward.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Mr. Rowe, I'll take from that answer that you did not inform any of the committees in the legislature that there was going to be that change to baseline. It wasn't included in the forecast. Is it appropriate, in your opinion, to announce significant or alert the legislature of significant changes in assumptions through a fiscal note?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, again, I guess I would disagree with the I guess I would disagree with the assertion that we were making a significant change in policy via fiscal note. I can understand how people might have different interpretations of that, but I guess I would just say that the agency was trying to provide a change in the base based on its understanding of the baseline assumptions.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Mr. Rowe, I'm not talking about a change in policy. I'm talking about a change in rate. I'm talking about a decision that the department made and did not communicate to the legislature as compared to the end of session budget from 2023. Now, again, as the author of that amendment that created the actuarial study, because I was concerned the underlying assumptions were too low, and the actuarial study showed that that was in fact a correct assumption. We also talked about the fact that the legislature should be notified if there was going to be a change. You know, we could take this to unemployment insurance. We just had that discussion last week, where it wasn't until I heard from small business owners that we were going to be increasing the premium on unemployment insurance. The agency didn't communicate that to the legislature and to the committees that have jurisdiction over those functions. So, Mr. Rowe, it's not about policy. It's about impact. So let's not talk about policy, right? We can argue whether you had the authority within the statute or not. The question is, there was a real cost that was hidden by the agency, highlighted by the Legislative Budget Office to say, no, this isn't right, and you ignored it. And they are the representative of a co-equal branch of government. So again, from your answer, and so my question is it appropriate to announce a significant cost increase via a fiscal note versus communicating with the committee chairs?
Senator Marty, Senator Pratt, I guess what I would say is our objective here is to proactively communicate, and we will work to communicate more proactively going forward. From the line of inquiry, that's certainly something I am taking away from this. I certainly think that it is important, it is absolutely important that the integrity of the Legislative Budget Office and the legislative budget process is respected. I take that very seriously. I think this particular fiscal note was challenging in the sense that there were multiple things changing at once, and we sought to do the very best that we could to provide clear information. I can understand that members have different views on this, but I would just say that it is absolutely our intent and our belief that it is important that there is clear communication, and we're going to work really hard to do that.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, Budget Director Mingy, could you come forward, please, and comment from MMB? Thank you, Commissioner Rowe. welcome to the committee. I don't know if you have a statement or just want to give brief comments or whatever.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Anna Mingy, State Budget Director and Assistant Commissioner at Minnesota Management and Budget. I don't have a presentation, but some remarks and reflections based on our engagement in this process and our work with fiscal notes over the last many years. You know, although M&B doesn't have a statutory role in the fiscal note process, as the Chief Financial Officer for the state, we are, very interested that fiscal notes be accurate, that they be consistent with our assumptions, and that they be provided to the legislature, in a timely and high-quality way so you can do the important work that you are here to do. Fiscal notes make assumptions about implementation and costs that are used to set appropriations for state agencies and or to adjust bills to achieve implementation goals. If fiscal notes aren't accurate, we might not have the balanced budget that we need to have, or a program may have more or less funding than they need to successfully operate. Fiscal notes are really interconnected with the way we implement and the way that we forecast our programs, and as you know, MMB does coordinate a twice-a-year budget and economic forecast. I would echo previous testifiers who stressed the complex and unique situation facing the paid family medical leave program. The paid family and medical leave program does not operate within the state's general fund. It operates in something known as an enterprise fund, which is treated differently in our state financial statements. Enterprise funds are typically not part of our budget and economic forecast because from an accounting perspective, they're not considered government funds. But what that meant is that when the agencies in the LBO were creating fiscal notes for the 2024 legislative session, there was a lack of a published baseline. And this creates confusion and puts significant weight on the fiscal note to clarify and educate about what the baseline is. There are often changes to a program from the time it's enacted to a subsequent legislative session where there are modifications. But so often for entitlement programs, those changes are happening within the general fund, and we have an opportunity to communicate those through the budget forecast. And in fact, we write a document that's 90 pages to talk about all of those changes. And so I think a key lesson here is that there are cases where additional financial statements, especially for things that we might not typically include in the forecast, can be really valuable, especially for new programs. So something that MMB has done in partnership with DEED is to begin publishing now a statement for the paid family leave fund within the Treasury that will be published twice a year to help clarify what is that starting point baseline and facilitate conversations about implementation assumptions earlier in the process rather than at the end of session when fiscal notes are moving really quickly and committees need the information to accomplish this work. That's something we do. It's something we've done in other places. For example, MMB also creates a statement for the premium security account, which is an account within the special revenue fund. And so we've made the determination that having additional information is really important for policymakers. So I think a key lesson here for our office is to think about where additional information could facilitate this process in a better way for you all. And Mr. Chair, that is sort of the extent of my comments, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Senator Drahan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your testimony and good discussion. We're just trying to figure it out, and part of our job is to debate, and kind of fight back and forth. But at the end of the day, whatever we pass has to work, and I think that's the goal of everybody up here. So I hope none of the testifiers take our discussion the wrong way, but we kind of need to know, you know what I mean? So that's why we're here today, and I appreciate the discussion. So you mentioned forecast, and question that was posed to me, we've had a lot of talk about long-term care facilities in the off session this year already. You know, it's a big issue in my district, and I think across the state. But it has to do with forecasting versus a fiscal note. So if you're going to have a program that the state forecasts X amount of dollars, and this is a Medicaid spending for the next biennium, is that guaranteed to be spent? Or how do we track that? You know, so if it's 800 million for long-term care, what happens there? Can you just give us a broad overview? And I might phone Senator Wickland for help on this one too.
Mr. Chair, Senator Draheim. So as you note, we conduct a current law forecast. And for programs such as medical assistance, we work with the Department of Human Services to project anticipated spending, looking at anticipated enrollment and anticipated payment rates primarily. And those are, the projections for those are based on many factors. They're very complex things like, you know, what do we project will happen in the economy? What do we believe nursing facility payment rate or expenditures will be, because those flow into future rate development. And, but just because something is forecast at a certain level for forecast programs such as medical assistance, that doesn't guarantee spending is at the level, because spending could be higher or lower based on the number of folks who are accessing the services and the cost per person, such as in this case of nursing facilities, the payment rates and, you know, the facilities, depending on what facility they're serving, and the rate for a given service. So no, the forecast, just because something is forecast at a certain level, that doesn't ensure that that is the specific amount we will spend. And the way that that is something that we monitor and provide updates on twice a year through the budget forecast, including sort of a retrospective on some actual expenditures.
Chair,
Draheim,
thank you. So do you use the same procedures with the forecast as you do the fiscal note? Are they the same, one and the same?
Mr. Chair, Senator Draheim, the for forecast programs, the agencies generally rely on similar models for fiscal notes as they do for the state budget forecast, yes, depending on the agency. I think in particular for state general fund entitlement programs, there are programs outside of the general fund where there's more natural fluctuation over time that aren't necessarily part of the forecast, and I think there are some nuance. So I don't want to speak with 100%, 100% that that's always the case, but I think generally the case, yes.
Chair, if I could just one more statement, and I'll let others ask questions. So I am referring to the value-based reimbursement.
Okay.
And, you know, if you could update me on that, maybe offline. I don't want to take up everybody's time here, but I know our long-term care facilities are really hurting, and it would be nice to understand why the forecast math is different than what a fiscal note math would be. And I know it's a moving target. I understand that. But to me, it should probably be the same principle for both. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Draheim. Senator Pratt and Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ms. Mingy. Quick question. So you don't have a statutory role in the fiscal notes, but you do review them, you do see them. Is that correct?
So, Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, M&B generally, just as a part of our role monitoring the state finances, we have a team of nonpartisan budget analysts who review fiscal notes sort of as a bill is approaching generally a finance committee hearing. So typically after a fiscal note is approved by the Legislative Budget Office and made public. There are, I think, select cases where we take a risk-based early sort of early engagement approach, especially where things are creating some complex new financial mechanisms or have to do with the state's bonding or the creation of a new forecast program, things like that. But generally, we are reviewing them sort of similar to the way legislative staff might have reviewed them prior to 2019, after the time of publication, identifying maybe where we see an issue or an inconsistency with the budget forecast.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ms. Mingy. And do you ever review the assumptions within a fiscal note to make sure that the agency is being reasonable?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, yes, I think that's part of the work that the team would do after, when reviewing a fiscal note in anticipation of a hearing.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this kind of goes to Senator Draheim's question around the forecast and the fiscal note. So I don't want to debate the merits of the program, but universal school meals, right? I sat here and I thought that fiscal note was too low. After the end of session in 2023, the November 23 forecast increased spending in that program $81 million, almost 20%. Then in the February forecast, it went up another $27 million, the February 2024 forecast. And now the November 24 forecast, spending on school lunch and breakfast programs is up another $32 million. Now, and what we're saying, the explanation has been we have more data. I've done forecasting in the corporate world and understand that oftentimes you'll use a conservative assumption, not to try to kill the bill, but to make sure that we have, maybe a worst case or conservative case for the program. And when I talk about lack of credibility in the fiscal note, it's this type of thing I'm talking about that's going through MMB and MMB looking at the assumptions and saying, gee, maybe we don't expect 40% of our kids to take free lunch. Maybe we should expect 90%, 100%, right? That's the problem that we're having, Ms. Mingy, with this. And I want to make sure that we're not just talking about deed in this case. I do believe, and let me ask you this, Ms. Mingy, Mr. Chair, if I might, sorry, I broke protocol. Ms. Mingy, were you aware that the Commissioner of Deed had increased the premium on the paid leave program? And was that communicated to the legislature?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, so we were not aware, or I should say, MMB as well, consulted with the LBO in helping them to identify the appropriate baseline for the use in the fiscal note. So we were engaged in this question of what is the right starting point. I think that's something that, as Director Larson mentioned, occurred across the agency, so DEED, MMB, the LBO, and fiscal staff. I think that there is a distinction between what is a decision, what is the decision for the rate that they would implement versus, or that they are choosing to implement in a public announcement versus what's the appropriate baseline assumption for a fiscal note. And that, I'm not meaning to parse words, but I do think that is something that's causing some friction here. I do think, though, that obviously the timing or lack of communication about that assumption clearly was an issue. And one thing that we always try to do in the forecast is to communicate changes in assumptions, because things happen between when a bill is enacted and as we learn more about the implementation. And then when we are making important changes in assumption, to make sure those are called out and documented in our forecast materials and raised with legislative fiscal staff so that things aren't a surprise when the session begins. I think clearly in the case of this paid family leave fiscal note and the appropriate premium rate in the first year, there was, not the appropriate level and timing of communication.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Mingy, I completely agree with your last statement, because the actuarial analysis gave us a few different scenarios that we could follow. One was to implement the 0.7 rate, the other was to change it. The decision of which scenario to choose was not communicated to the legislature. It sounds like it wasn't even communicated to MMB because it wasn't in the forecast. So I find that troubling, and I do think it was, when we talk about the assumptions that were put into the school lunch or the school meal program, the accusation is that if the agency wants something to happen, they will underestimate the cost. If they don't want something to happen, I believe I've heard it called death by fiscal note for a bill. And we need to have trust that these are credible fiscal notes. The assumptions in the school meal program, I think, underline that as well, but certainly the communication, right? When you're presented multiple scenarios, I absolutely agree with you. The communication should have been better. The communication should have been better with MMB, and the communication should have been better with the legislature. And I don't always believe that agencies view the legislature as a co-equal branch. I think they are not giving us fiscal notes that are objective. When I look back at the underlying statute for fiscal notes, they are supposed to include the assumptions used in determining the cost and estimates, and are really supposed to be mechanisms, not opinions. And sometimes we here on the other side of the table feel much differently about that. And I hope MMB will take a more active role in working with the LBO to make sure that these happen. And I hope that you'll be working with your agencies as well to improve communication within the executive branch, because it sounds like this was a breakdown in communication all across the board. And I don't believe that we should ever find out about $180 million change in assumptions through a fiscal note and just assume that it really had no impact. It was already baked into the cost when it never was. It wasn't baked into the forecast. It wasn't baked into any of the assumptions we had. We just had what appeared to us to be an arbitrary change, one that was in fact rooted in some data, because it was my amendment that created the actuarial study. But I hope that you'll take that back as the office of the Chief Financial Officer and work with us to make that improvement.
Senator Marty, Senator Brett, I think I would just say we're happy to talk with the LB about how MMB can support the fiscal note process. We certainly wanted to work well for everyone.
Thank you. Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks to the testifiers, including you, Ms. Mengy. I think I'm going to agree with Senator Pratt to a point here. And Deputy Commissioner Rowe, we ask these tough questions, and I hope we bring the same standard to our work that you would want people in your office to bring, which is a little bit of separation between the branches, a little bit of accountability, and we may be in different political parties, but this may be the most we've agreed in the Finance Committee in years. People expect us to ask questions even when they're not comfortable. In fact, I think most Minnesotans would say that is exactly when I want legislators to ask those tough questions. And it shouldn't matter what political party the governor makes his appointments. It should matter, do we have some questions? You've identified, Senator Pratt, an instance where we should have better communication. I'm a little more optimistic that the people that work in these agencies do great work, and that this may have been an instance where we wish we would have done it better, and we will do it better going forward. In my 9 years in the Senate, I have never said this on the record, but I am the son of a state Senate budget analyst who then became Senate Chief of Staff in another state. And I think what I would want you to take back to the people at MMB, at LBO, at DEED, is you should not do anything in your daily work that you're not prepared to sit in the testifier seat in front of the Senate Finance Committee and answer questions about, and we will do the same for you. The questions that you put to legislators, you should have the same high expectations. I think that's what Minnesotans want, and I also think that's what Minnesotans were saying in November, which is keep an eye on the bottom line, keep an eye on our tax dollars. I think you do great work. This is an example of something we could do a little bit better. And as the Vice Chair, Mr. Chair, I hope you don't mind me welcoming Senator Jasinski to the Finance Committee, not to pivot a little bit, but I'm glad to have you, Senator. Welcome to the show. Thank you.
And Senator Jasinski, yes, I apologize at the beginning, since this is now the more permanent Senate Finance Committee, and I noticed that Senator Westrom is leaving the committee and you are joining the committee. We welcome you on a more permanent basis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to be on the Finance Committee in my 9th year, so it took a while to get here, but I plan on sticking around for a while, so thank you.
Thank you. And I want to just close with a couple of comments, observations. First of all, I think the fiscal note we used to discuss this issue today is, I think we all recognize it was far more complicated and a lot of other things going on than typical fiscal notes. But I think we also recognize, I think there are lots of time pressures here. And I know that at the time fiscal notes are put into place, the legislature needs them right away and needs them quick. And recognizing that, I think the biggest single takeaway is I think we need better communication. And I guess I hope for agencies, all state agencies, that they recognize that fiscal notes are not the appropriate place to announce assumptions or baselines, and that there can be dispute over what the assumptions are and what the baselines are, but those have to be communicated outside of this and should be discussed when an agency feels something is unclear in legislation. Certainly the author and the leads of the committees should be all notified of what's happening, so it's not a surprise when the fiscal note comes out. So I think that's one thing I hope that agencies are taking from this, that the legislature takes the LBO's role seriously, and it's our job to make sure agencies respect it, so we want that to happen. And for MMB, the one thing I will just suggest is that keep doing what you're doing in terms of trying to make sure all agencies hear these things, because I think one of the things that MMB has been working on, both with all these types of procedural things, to make sure agencies are kind of uniform across the place in respecting this. In terms of LBO, when there are, like in this case, the fiscal notes, the budget office put a comment on page 2 of the fiscal note on discussing these things, and it's in tiny type as footnotes are. But I think that somehow it doesn't require, I mean, Director Larson, you mentioned that we could do additional analysis, and so I'm not suggesting additional analysis. I'm just thinking that that could be highlighted more. Maybe if we have a disagreement, if the budget office doesn't feel a thing is meeting standards, that it's not just a little footnote, but maybe that same language is put up front so everybody knows it. And with that, when there are those disputes, showing charts, either in the fiscal note, presumably showing here's where it was, here's where the premium rate was, as the legislature understood it, here's the premium rate that's assumed in the fiscal note, so the legislature can see all those differences. And I think so the LBO, to the extent that you're able to, one, make sure the fiscal notes show those things, so if there is a disagreement on what the baseline or what assumptions are, that those are highlighted very clearly so the legislature has the best information. And with that, again, I think the number one summary I'd make is for everyone involved that communication matters, and I think the best we can do with that, the best. So Any other comments, Senator Pratt or Senator Wickland? Senator Pratt?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, I just want to highlight that this is a concern that many of us have had just outside of this one fiscal note. Whether we're talking about the missed assumptions on the school meal program, missed assumptions from the Met Council on a FAIR program, missed assumptions on Senator Port's legalizing cannabis when after 7 committee stops, there were still blank appropriations in the bill, and there was no fiscal assumptions from the state troopers. Some question on the impact to the Department of Public Safety and if there was going to be any expected impact from the Trunk Highway Fund. So, Mr. Chair, I go back to suggestion number 6 from Mr. Larson's presentation, and look to formalize some sort of action on making sure that we establish that working group to consider updates to the uniform standards. Whether or not we and how that's constituted. I think Senator Wickland and the new chair of the LBO Oversight Commission, and we can figure that out along with Mr. Nauman, Mr. Larson, and would certainly appreciate MMB's input on that process as well. But I think it would be a failure on the legislature's part not to take some sort of action and make that a firm expectation this session and prior to next session.
I hear you and agree, and that's good message for Senator Wickland. Go ahead, as chair of the Oversight Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just would add that, if we do something like that, I think that working group should also talk about what are limitations of the current systems that we use, and how is that a barrier to some of the clarity and display of information. I think that we are working within a system that's been around for quite a while, and I think over the years there are different constraints that we have to work with that are not helping us with trying to achieve clear communication. So, I think a working group or, subset of the members, or, if we can get commitment from legislators to put the time in to that, I think that would be really helpful.
Good point. I think legislators like to create commissions and don't like to serve on them. But I think the LBOOC, the Legislative Budget Office Oversight Commission, will be looking into this further. So with that, if there's no further business, I'll just say next week we don't have any hearings set yet. We're still working on some things. We'll let you know as soon as we have a sense. But I don't think we would be meeting more than one day next week. With that, this meeting is adjourned.